All right, good afternoon. My name is Bill Farah. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications for the ACLU of Virginia. Here with Charlie Schmidt, who's our Public Policy Counsel and our in-house expert on knowing your rights at protests and demonstrations. We're looking forward to talking about that with you today, and hopefully be able to talk a little bit also about interacting with police, whether at a demonstration or elsewhere, and also share some information about our mobile app. I do want to invite you to ask us questions. Just go ahead and post those in the comments while we're talking, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. So thanks again, Charlie. Thank you for taking time
You're very welcome.
to be with us today.
You're very welcome.
First of all, before we talk about logistics and what happens when you're out at a protest and that kind of thing, everybody knows First Amendment protects our free speech rights in this country. But what exactly does that mean?
Correct. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that broadly we say, of course, we have First Amendment rights, but when you get down to specifics and you start asking folks, they may have some confusion as to what's allowed, what's not allowed, and to what degree. We're dealing with your rights and everyone's rights to protest and demonstrate, but also you have to weigh that against other people's rights to go about their daily business, for the government to do its business, for public safety concerns, all that kind of stuff. So there's a balancing act there. So sometimes when you get into specifics, but generally, what we're talking about is your right to be in a public space and be able to express your grievances, express your opinions, and also, most importantly, engage your fellow citizens. Not just protest against the government, but engage your fellow citizens in your message. And whether that's a political message, a religious message, it does not matter. The content itself does not matter, right? We're talking about regulations or any sort of reasonable regulations that a city or a government puts on free speech. At the very basics, they have to be content neutral. In other words, we're not going to allow religious folks to come to this plaza. We're only going to allow students in this public space, right. That sort of thing. But I also want to take a step back and make sure we address to everyone that's out there listening. First and foremost, we're going to be talking generally about First Amendment rights and police encounters, but we're going to really be specific with Virginia. Okay, and so each state has its own nuances when it comes to sort of how they handle certain protests and demonstrations, and even down to a locality. So I would definitely want folks out there to know that we're going to be talking about Virginia. We're also going to be talking, hopefully, about some specifics here in Richmond. And of course, this is all for informational purposes only. We want to make sure that's clear, because if anybody out there has individual questions, they really do need to speak to an attorney or contact the ACLU of Virginia at ACLU-VA.org. Or if you're in another state and watching, contact the affiliate in your state to get more detailed answers to questions. So, yeah, as I was saying, we grow up with this idea that free speech and being able to protest and demonstrate, but it's more than that. It's your ability to go out on the street and hand out flyers, your ability to stand with a picket sign, your ability to stand on the corner and preach, your ability to stop people for a reasonable amount of time and try and hand literature. You can't block the street. You can't be forceful. You can't be obstructive. But it's vital to our democracy to be able to air our grievances, but also engage our fellow citizens and our fellow community members in public dialogue. Right. So that's really the primary, and why it's part of the First Amendment, is it's primary to how we function.
As a right to dissent.
Exactly. It's very important to have that dissenting voice in politics.
So, and to that, voices of dissent are not always received well. Sometimes people say things we don't like, or we might say something someone else doesn't like. What about offensive or controversial speech?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I think when you look at other developed nations, and we don't have to go into a lot of details about Europe or any other area, but there are European countries and other countries that have adopted sort of restrictions, very tight restrictions on what they consider hate speech or offensive speech, and we don't have that. And some would say that's a problem, particularly when you're dealing with something that's hateful or hurtful or if an actual identified hate group such as the KKK wants to come and march in your city, we as a society have dictated and demanded that they have a right, as much as I have a right, to stand in the public space and engage in their not so nice speech.
And the ACLU has very aggressively defended the rights
Yes.
of groups like that.
Absolutely.
Over decades.
Absolutely. It's almost sometimes more important for minority opinions and minority voices to be heard. And so that is definitely a vital part of the protections of free speech. So we may not like the message, but we can't stifle the messenger. I think as a society, we Americans understand that's a larger problem, is to try and stifle that dissenting opinion.
Okay, so we've seen protests here in Richmond and across the country in recent weeks, months. Also seen counter protests. We have folks coming out to express one point of view, and another group will come to try to balance that, or whatever their objective. What about counter protesters? What rights do they have?
Well, yeah. So this has been an interesting issue, particularly given the recent election. And any run up to a political election, you're going to have opposing viewpoints. You're going to have opposing parties, that sort of thing. Our First Amendment and courts have made it very clear that counter protesters, anybody that shows up to counter protest an original protest group, have the exact same rights to be there. Particularly and most importantly, if it's a public space. So if I decide to take my friends out and go protest or picket on a sidewalk, and I'm approached by counter-protesters that have the exact opposite view of me, they have to be allowed the same space as myself. And where that comes most important is how the police or local law enforcement react to that. The courts have dictated that local law enforcement have to make room for counter-protesters and protesters. And what's also interesting, in the past, some jurisdictions and other areas have tried to corral counter-protesters really far away, or put them over in a space or behind a barricade or something like that. And the Supreme Court has said that that's not allowed. The counter-protesters have to be within earshot. They have to be able to be heard by the initial protesters, or whoever is whoever the target of the counter protest is. They have to be able to engage, and a lot of people would see that as potential hostility, and there could be, but that is the job of local law enforcement, is to make sure that those groups can get close enough so that their messages can be heard by each other and potentially peacefully engage each other. But they also have to make sure that each side is safe, each side has that voice, and at the same time. So if a march happens and counter-protesters come up, the police can't tell those counter-protesters to just leave. They have to allow them space behind or beside, or to march side by side. They have to. Of course, the police are given a lot of leeway in how they keep people safe, but that's vital to, again, our democracy.
Okay, interesting. And so, if I'm attending a protest or demonstration, or if I organize one, are there places where I can and can't do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally, the default is when you have public property, it's considered a public space or public forum. And that's very important, because when you're dealing with an actual public forum, say a sidewalk or a park that's been designated public forum, or sometimes there's a plaza set aside in front of a government building that is public forum. Generally, that is open to the public. That is where you have sort of your most freedom to express yourself, and also speech needs to be protected in those public forums. When you have a limited public forum, say a public meeting, school board, city council, that sort of thing, generally at those you will have a public comment period, which allows for you to get up and speak your piece, and then you have to sit down and be quiet because there's work that the government has to do, or there's certain things that they have to get done. So the courts have allowed limited restrictions, and what they call time, place, and manner restrictions. They have to be reasonable, and of course content neutral. But the added issue.
Explain what you mean once again by content neutral. Everybody may not understand.
Yeah, sure. So if let's say, for instance, a city council meeting or county board of supervisors host a meeting, and they have a public comment period. They can't
say, don't speak about this, you
Right.
can't comment on.
Exactly. If it's a
X,
pure
Y, Z.
public comment period, you can go in and talk about anything you want, and I really encourage people to go and seek out their public bodies, because people will get up and talk about anything and everything during those public comment periods. Like I said, when they have business to get down to, then they can say, well, let's limit the discussion to this particular agenda item,
Right,
that
right,
sort
right.
of thing. But when
Different public comment is different than a public hearing.
Right.
Which might be on a specific ordinance or something.
Exactly,
like that.
exactly. So if they have a public hearing on, say, school funding, they can cut you off if you go in as a member of the public and start talking about, I don't know, the potholes in your street or something like that. They could say, like, that's not appropriate, we need to get on to business, that sort of thing.
But public forum, I guess off a little bit, public forum, as you're talking about it in this context, is different.
Right.
So.
Right, so when we talk about a pure public forum, public space, there is no, there's no restriction. Like I said, if you want to go down on a sidewalk and protest and picket, there's generally no restrictions. It's more of a default, don't obstruct, don't block people, make sure that, you're not blocking the entrance to it. Just general common sense and common courtesy ideas of, if I'm gonna go out and hold up a picket sign in a public forum, then I have to allow for regular pedestrian flow of traffic, and I have to, step aside if somebody needs to get by, that sort of thing. When you get into a public forum or public space, or when someone wants to have a rally or demonstration where there's going to be a significant amount of people, what the courts have allowed and what every jurisdiction now has is some process by way of either a permit or notifying the local law enforcement that we're planning to have a student protest, for instance, and we're expecting 100, 200, 300 people, and the way it's been, it's a little general in its terminology, but the idea is that if there's a reasonable chance that you could foresee blocking the sidewalk or blocking the street or blocking the entrance to a building. So if I wanted to go down and to the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, I wanted to go down with my friends and protest out in front of that building, and I realized that maybe I put something up on Facebook and say, come on down and join me, and then I realized it starts to balloon to 100, 150 people, and at that point you need to check in with your local jurisdiction and apply for a permit.
It's a safety concern.
Right,
it's not
exactly.
about restricting any
No.
speech,
And
it's a
I
safety
mean,
concern.
even within that permit process, again, has to be content neutral. They can't say, well, we don't like your message, or we think your message is going to be too controversial, so we're not going to give you the permit.
Right.
That's supposed to be completely content neutral. Take, for instance, Richmond. Richmond has a process, has it written in its code where it's more than 10 or more than 10 people, which is kind of low, but also the provisions of if it's reasonably expected to block traffic, or you're going to need some sort of police escort in order to get through intersections or walk in the street because it's going to be too many people to walk on the sidewalk, you need to apply for a permit. Now, within that same provisions, and what the courts have also allowed is for spontaneous demonstrations, which, obviously this past week after the elections, a lot of spontaneous demonstrations have happened because they're reacting to something in the news, they're reacting to, even something as simple as, your hometown team wins the Super Bowl,
Sure.
right? You can't.
So it feels urgent.
Yeah, exactly.
It feels like you have to do it now.
Right, if the group is responding to, some major political event, then they don't have to get a permit. It's still, I would still recommend, and I think others, would recommend the same thing, that you call, check in if it's possible, but you're not expected to go through a permit process, for stuff like that.
Okay, so public forum then is the sort of everybody's space.
Right.
Right. So that can be confusing though. What about schools, universities, government buildings?
Right. Right. So generally, schools are schools like elementary schools, secondary schools are obviously kind of separate, even though they are public buildings, because of the issue with children being there and the safety of children. But Generally, when you go outside the school grounds onto the sidewalk or onto the road closest to the school, those are considered, public forum, public access. So generally, you're dealing with just about all roads, sidewalks, in medians, even Richmond and other localities, have a lot of roads with medians. You can stand out on the median with a sign. Now, I will caution that Richmond and some other jurisdictions have an anti-panhandling ordinance where you can't stand on the median and solicit money or donations, but you can stand there with a sign, or basically the activities of a median are exactly the same as a sidewalk. Most parks, most public spaces, such as parks, public forums, or some sort of plaza, outside of, there's a couple of them in and around the Capitol that deal, like out in front of, you can go out in front of City Hall, you can go over to, Monroe Park, or different parks that have been designated as sort of public space and open.
So what about private property? Because we talk about sidewalks as a good example of public space and right away. But what if I want to go over to Stony Point Fashion Park and have a demonstration? They have sidewalks. Right. What's the difference?
Right. So big difference is once you cross that line onto private property, then you're subject to the owners.
So that's part of private development.
Right. Exactly. So there's a little bit of there's a little bit of protections when you have something that's considered when you're inviting the public in. So you have a space such as Stony Point Fashion Park, or a shopping center, or any business where you're opening yourselves up to people. When you're opening yourself up to public accommodations, then you have to be fair in who you allow in. You can't say sorry. We don't allow certain religious groups or certain people of color into our establishment. Like that's obvious. But if you go in and start protesting or demonstrating into a mall or a private property, then that owner is within their rights to ask you to leave because it's disrupting their business. Like, it's not considered a full public forum where you're allowed to do that. It's an interesting point too to bring up that when there is a public event hosted at say even a school or the Coliseum or any kind of venue, if that's a public event that's open to the public, but it's rented and sort of controlled by one particular group, say one particular political party, then they get to control their message within that venue, if that makes sense. So, if I want to rent out the Coliseum and invite the public in to hear my message, I'm allowed to basically remove counter-protesters. I can ask people to leave if they start disrupting my message because I have rented that space that is my venue. So it's a little bit different than if I'm just out in a park or in a public space and wanting to have a rally or a demonstration, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. And you talk about handing out flyers and leaflets, picketing, that kind of thing. What types of things are not allowed, or is there anything?
Generally, if you're talking about handing out flyers, picketing, that sort of thing, you're just about any material that you can hand out, anything in the message is fine. Most jurisdictions have, including Richmond, have no posting signs, so you're technically not allowed to post signs on like a light post or a phone pole, or even stick a political sign in a median or a public space. It's not to say that you're going to get a ticket for it, but other people have the right to remove that sign. So if I go and put up a poster on a flag on a phone pole, then someone can come down right behind me and tear it off, and I don't have any recourse against that person. The same thing with, if I'm handing out literature and someone takes it, rips it up, throws it away, I don't have any recourse as far as that. It's sort of open for all. What's not allowed is, like I said, aggressive, trying to stop people or block people. You can approach someone, engage them and ask them questions, but, if they obviously give you very clear signs that they're not interested, you can't block the sidewalk, you can't block their way of, their pathway. And so it's very important that, again, it kind of boils down to courtesy. Sure. Just general courtesy of how you would approach someone and how you would get your message out there. There's also been some confusion in the past, for folks that want to stand and picket
Right.
and just stand still. There have been cases where police will come up and tell folks that they have to keep moving, they can't stand still. And it's kind of an unsettled area of the law. There have been, there was after Ferguson in Missouri, there was a court case out there that said that's not appropriate. If someone wants to stand and they're not obstructing traffic, there's no reason to make protesters move around, just arbitrarily march back and forth. Like if I want to stand there and preach, or if I want to stand there and talk to you and hand you something, come walk with me. It makes no sense.
Right.
So, but we, like I said, instances where people have said, well, the police tell us that we have to keep moving and have to keep circulating, that sort of thing. The other thing that's really important when you're out, just in general, but particularly with protesting or picketing or anything like that, is you have an absolute right in Virginia to film in public. You can film people in public. You certainly can and should film the police, or if you are picketing and any police show up, it is well within your right to film the police. So you can stand there and record your activities, whether it's for your own use or for your own protection. So, and again, there have been some questions about, can I film the police? Can I, if they tell me to stop, do I have to stop filming?
And you hear a lot of times the police will say, well, you have evidence of a crime being committed. You took evidence of a crime being committed and want to take your phone.
Right. Well, yeah. Generally, if you're filming a crime and they have reasonable expectation, or they have reasonable knowledge that there's evidence on that phone, then yes, they can seize the phone for evidentiary purposes.
So what if they just say, stop, this is a crime scene now?
Oh yeah. So that's a little bit different. But yeah, to talk about the issue, if your phone is confiscated for any reason, the courts have said that they need a warrant in order to get into your phone, into your data, into your personal phone for any reason. And if your phone is ever confiscated, you really do need to speak to a lawyer, or if you can't afford a lawyer, you don't know a lawyer, contact the ACLU of Virginia, or call down to the police station to make sure that they're not just confiscating your phone to make sure it's still there, that you can get it back,
Sure.
And that they're going through the proper channels that they're properly getting a warrant and supposed to be able to take it. Now, if you're standing and filming something, and we have had reports of this where someone's just either on an overpass looking down the freeway or standing well back but just filming, the law is definitely unsettled and unclear as to what constitutes sort of a crime scene, right? Mm-hmm. So the police may ask you to step back because they may say this is a crime scene now, we need you to step back, and you definitely need to obey police orders and take a step back. If they tell you to continue to take a step back, continue to take a step back. Try and still film and be able to have a clear shot to film. But as of now, there are no the way the code is written, it talks about reasonableness of a crime scene and the ability for police to reasonably do their job and keep people safe.
Right.
Well, arguably what would be unreasonable is to declare a massive area, say around the freeway,
right.
The whole thing's a crime scene, everybody has to leave, or to say if you're on the street filming an accident or filming an interaction with the police and some other police officer comes and tells you to go around the corner. Right? Well, in instances like that, we definitely would ask that you contact the ACLU or your affiliate, ACLU-VA.org, or your affiliate in your own state, because it's definitely something that needs to be addressed if police are sort of abusing that power to say.
And that applies to any situation where you're following the rules, you're in public space, you're expressing your thoughts, and you feel that police have violated your right to do that.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely, yeah. I would say, and particularly these general instances, if a police officer ever tells you to stop filming, if they take your camera, or if they tell you to
leave,
leave or back up, or push you back till you can't be seen anymore, or if they try and stand in front of your camera and block what's going on, keep recording, obey the police orders, but definitely get in touch with the ACLU or an attorney, because that is something that needs to be reported. The other thing that's very important into policing encounter,
Right,
which
right.
is a good transition. But one of the things that's very important, this applies again to jurisdictions here in Virginia, and certainly with Richmond. But the idea is that police officers are many jurisdictions have now bought into community policing, and they want their police officers to interact with the public. So you should always be able to identify the officer that's in front of you, most easily by their name. If they're not wearing a name tag, you should ask their name. They should give you their name. If you're recording them and something happens and they step in front of you and they refuse to give your name, or they take your camera or anything like that, we ask that you try to record or write down as many details about the individual officer, because that individual officer needs to be reported back to obviously their supervising officer or the law enforcement agency. But it's also one of those things that we as a general public need to get into the habit of being able to talk to our police officers as an individual. Like, this is an individual officer. This is not some militarized robot that won't interact with me, and that's very important. And it's also very important with just generally speaking about interactions with police officers. We've talked about this, and other affiliates in our national office have really focused on de-escalation.
Right.
And that is one of the key measures to de-escalation, is to be able to say, okay, this is the officer that I interacted with. I didn't like what happened. I thought that my rights were infringed upon. I need to be able to report that. Stay calm, be able to report it in a professional manner.
So we
and
talk
that,
about
of course,
this.
it's hard to do if it's just an officer that is geared up in riot gear and not
Right.
able to and refuses to speak to you and refuses to engage with you, or is doing something like blocking your line of sight or trying to push you back out of the way, or infringing upon your rights.
Right, and we talk about this a lot, because you would see these situations. Whose job is it to make sure that a situation like that doesn't get escalated unnecessarily?
Right, so that's an important point, is in dealing with the police, anytime you're dealing with a police officer, and police officers are human, they have bad days, they get,
Sure.
Just like us, we get enraged, we get upset. So if you're confronted with a police officer that you think is being aggressive, the first thing to sort of, that you can do is ask for a supervisor. And it can be hard in the moment with that officer there, but generally, if it calls for a situation where that officer is that emotional, whether it's at a protest or demonstration, or just some activity that has raised that officer's awareness, then odds are there's another police officer somewhere nearby. And you're perfectly within your rights, and it's reasonable for you to ask, either speak to another officer, and certainly Virginia and other jurisdictions and other states, officers police themselves. So the training, how the officer acts and how that officer reacts goes back to the leadership within that law enforcement agency. So chief of police, there is some structure in place. There's some internal investigation that allows for grievances to be filed against that officer. And it's very important that if you feel like, maybe not even your constitutional rights, or if it's just an officer that is rude.
Right, feels wrong.
Yeah, it just feels wrong, or they're rude, or they were, didn't take you seriously, or they didn't listen to you, then, we highly encourage that you seek out that grievance process and how to be able to report them, because, that officer could react just mildly one day and react terribly the next day if they're not, monitored and properly.
Right, and while we do emphasize it as the trained officer's responsibility to make sure situations don't escalate, getting combative, with an officer in a situation, I pay your taxes kind of thing is not the way to go, right?
Right. And I mean, that's important. It's hard.
I pay your salary.
Yeah. I pay my taxes for your salary. I'm your boss. That sort of rhetoric is not helpful. Yeah. It is very hard. It's not to put the responsibility on the person. You as the individual that was stopped. They're the police. They're the ones that are supposed to be professional. They're the ones that are trained for the actions. It's nerve-wracking to people, but you know, we try and tell people to stay calm, try and take a deep breath, don't answer any questions that, you know, certainly don't even have to answer questions right away. There's no reason to feel rushed with anything, and all of that can kind of de-escalate and diffuse the situation, you know. And so yeah, it's important to remain calm. It's important not to, you know, I mean, you have a constitutional right to be mouthy and, you know, be a jerk, but yeah, I would recommend, I think most people would recommend that you not engage a police officer, because what it is, you know, particularly if it comes to the point where there's a grievance or there's something filed against you or filed against the officer, and there, you know, if that officer has a body-worn camera or someone else is filming or something comes up, you know, even if it's not an infringement on civil liberties, if the police officer was misbehaving, then it shows on there, you know, that you also were yelling at them and in their face. It's, you know, yeah, that's your right, but it's going to be hard for that supervisor to take it seriously that, you know, everything got sort of spun out of control. But we definitely, you know, do some recommendations when stopped by the police or when interacting with the police. You know, try to remain calm, but understand that it is going to be, it's always nerve-wracking, even for folks that interact with the police all the time or are out there, and have been at protests and interacted with the police. But a couple of pointers that we talk about is to, you know, try to get the officer's name. Like I said, try and understand the name of the officer that you are interacting with. That's very important as a follow-up. You know, you don't have to tell them your rights, you know, as far as like, I have a right to film, or I have a right to this. You don't have to argue your rights on the street, and we would suggest that you don't. But what's more important than trying to argue your rights is to make clear that you're asserting your rights. And that's different. You know, you're not arguing with the officer. I'm not saying I have a right to do this, this, and this.
But attempting to.
My assertion is I want to know why I'm being detained. You know, so I say things like, "Am I free to go?" You know, ask the officer questions. You can ask the officer questions.
Am I being detained?
Right. Am I being detained, or am I free to go? If they say you are being detained, you can say why. You know, why am I being stopped? That sort of thing. That, again, you asking questions of the officer allows the situation to de-escalate, and also, you know, it shows that you're asserting your rights.
And sometimes, I mean, we're talking about situations that can get out of hand, that do escalate, but I mean, sometimes these infringements can be very subtle. You know, we hear a lot, you know, from law enforcement now about comply now, complain later. What do we think about that?
You know, that goes back to, it's not on you to comply, as far as waiving your rights, and that's the distinction. Yeah.
That says where are you going? What are you doing here?
Right. Exactly. So if the officer starts asking you questions, you know, the first thing is to say, well, am I being detained? Right? Because that is very important, because that signals to you, if you are being detained, that they suspect you of a crime, and you need to be very careful about any questions you ask. I would, you know, we would say don't answer their questions. So
right, because you might inadvertently incriminate.
Exactly.
That may be the only evidence they have to charge you with a crime.
Right, exactly. So you never know, if you start answering their questions, you never know where their questions are going to lead. So always the first question with the officer is, am I being detained, and why am I being detained? So
right.
That helps. But no, you absolutely don't have to answer any of the officer's questions, and you probably shouldn't. Now, if you're driving, you have a statutory compliance to produce your license and tell the officer, you know, give them your name so that they can identify you because of the driving laws. But when you're walking on the street and an officer approaches you and stops you, you know, you're under no obligation to give them any information or answer any of their questions. And so asking them questions helps you assert your rights. And so we really suggest that, you know, if you're going to be stopped by the police, or if you're interacting with the police, that you be very careful about what questions you answer. Also, you know, you need to be very direct in telling the officer that you, things like you do not consent to a search.
Right.
That is very important. And if they do start to arrest you or start to detain you, you know, you need to make it also very clear. You need to proactively say, I want to speak to an attorney. And the reason you need to say that out loud, both those things, is I do not consent to searches and I would like to speak to an attorney, is at that point, that is basically the cue to the police officer that if you ask for an attorney, they should not be asking you any questions, right? So that could be why that weighs in your favor if in a court proceeding, if that comes up. The other thing with consenting to searches, always make it clear to the officer. Tell them very nicely, but very forcefully, I do not consent to searches. I'm sorry, I will not consent to you looking in my bag, looking in my pocket, looking in my car, anything. I don't care.
So that can be really hard. I mean, an officer says,
yeah.
you know, would you mind if I take a look in your vehicle?
Sure.
You know, and if I don't know these things.
Yeah. Well, the classic too is, you know, you have to understand that we citizens can't lie to the police, right? If they ask us a question, we have to answer it directly. We have to answer it truthfully. We don't have to answer it at all, and that's why we say don't answer it at all, because you have to answer it truthfully. You never know what you're walking yourself into. The other side of that coin is police are allowed to lie to you. Courts have said that in their investigation they can lie to folks and make promises that aren't true. So the classic promise is, well, just let me look in your trunk and it'll be better
you'll be on your way.
Yeah, and you'll be on your way. That's not true. And what happens is a lot of times they only have reasonable suspicion to pull you over for something, but not probable cause to go further, or they may even need a warrant to search certain areas of the car, certain areas of your person or in your home, and they don't have that. And so they're looking for consent, because if they get consent from you, it cures whatever, you know, pretext stop or any sort of problems they had. So, and they're trained with this, and I mean, they know that if they can get you to consent to that search, then everything's fine after that. No matter what their bad behavior was, it's sort of washed clean. You consented, you've waived your rights at that point, so it's very important. And the same thing with not answering questions and being able to speak to an attorney is the same thing, where, you know, you've made it clear to them that you want to speak to an attorney and that you don't want to answer any more of their questions.
Gotcha. I want to make sure we don't lose people before we have some other things to talk about. Anything you want to talk about?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So you mentioned filming earlier, and I want to make sure we get a plug in here for the ACLU of Virginia's free smartphone app. It's available for iPhone and Android, and you know where to go and get those things. There's no cost for it. And basically, Charlotte's going to pull it up here. What this does is, of course, you can film interactions with police or interactions with other people legally, but all too often what happens is the phone gets confiscated, things magically disappear, whatever happens. So this automatically sends the video to the ACLU so that our legal folks can take a look at it and determine if anyone's rights have been violated. There's an optional incident report that is very helpful if you can give us some basic details about who you are and what happened, so we can follow up. Otherwise, we've got a video, which is great, but not, you know, doesn't fill in all the details of this story. So we're trying to encourage people to expand. The original intent of this was to film interactions with police, but also when you're at a demonstration, when you're at a protest or something like that, document. Right.
Exactly. And I mean, it also has, you know, there's some other functions on here, but what's also interesting and great is there's a little section on know your rights for filming the police encounters and that sort of thing, so you can kind of take it with you if you need, sort of on the fly. It's very handy, and like I said, there have been instances where phones are confiscated, broken, smashed, or, you know, even if your battery drains or something goes wrong, as soon as it stops recording for any of those reasons, it sends it back up through the cloud to our archives, so we'll get an alert of that.
And there's also a really cool witness feature on there, where basically you turn witness mode on, and it will alert you if there's someone down the block who is using mobile justice to film something. It will send you an alert, and you can go and get additional video, which can be very helpful to get, you know, different perspectives on
Right, exactly. Particularly if there's a really large demonstration, you can use that witness button. It'll ping the map basically and say, well, you know, they're on the other side of the block or around the corner, and I need to go over there and see what's going on. There's also, you know, great, if you download the app, you can also get notifications and notices about, you know, what's happening, that sort of thing. So it's really helpful.
Great. Well, I'm looking here to see if we have any questions, and I see several comments, which we appreciate. I don't see any direct questions at this point. I would like to offer, as offer Charlie. Charlie has been doing a lot of these talks, going to community groups and interested parties around the state. You were just in Bristol this weekend, and in Northern Virginia doing this. Actually, you have one tonight.
Yeah, we have one tonight here in Richmond, Virginia. It's going to be at Gallery 5. It's co-hosted with RVA Preservation, which is a new group that is together and trying to do more community engagement and that sort of thing, and let people sort of, train folks to be community minded and social justice engaged. And so it's at Gallery 5, which I believe is 200 West Marshall.
Okay.
The Gallery 5, you can Google it. It's tonight, it starts at 7, and we'll be kind of doing the same. We'll be doing the same training and have handouts and be able to answer questions directly too. So.
Right, and we've had good turnout at those so far, and want to continue wherever there's interest. So if you can't make it tonight, you have a group that you'd like to either get some information.
Right.
Just you want information, we can send that to you, or you would like for Charlie or another speaker to come out and talk about your rights at protests and interacting with police.
Always happy
let
to
us know.
take it. Yeah, always happy to come out and talk to folks.
ACLU-VA at ACLU-VA.org is a good way to do that. Anything else you want to add that we should be talking about?
People actually have questions, but
Okay.
all of that not show on the post on timeline. So
Oh,
you may
okay.
want to check out the link that I just sent you on
Okay.
Messenger.
We'll see if technically we can
Yeah,
get
people have a
some
few
other
questions.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to have to take a second to read down. Charlie, if you want to
I don't know if I've
fill
got
the space.
Okay,
Okay, here's a question.
Okay.
If you have a permit to hold a rally in a public space, do you have a legal right to exclude counter-protesters or people threatening the event? We talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's a clarification. If you have a permit for a public space, then yes, that is your, you've in a sense rented, or your interest is in that public space. You have a right to be there. You have a right to send out your message. Again, counter-protesters are allowed to be near there. They're allowed to be in the public space, but it is up to the police to, make sure that they're not interrupting you and disrupting your planned activity.
Okay.
And it really is, for stuff like that, it's a fine line. And again, I would really encourage it if people think if people know of instances where law enforcement are not handling the situation well,
Right.
they need to contact us, because we can reach out to those law enforcement and say, look, here's what you did at this particular rally. It would be better if you tried to keep it so that the folks weren't scuffling, or there was not enough ability for folks to interact and engage. And it's not always just about more police presence at something like that. And it's also really key to understand that if you want to plan a protest or a rally in a public space or in a public park, there could be reasonable fees attached to that.
Right.
I kind of didn't talk about that, but there could be reasonable fees for police officers to secure the area, barricades, that sort of stuff. The courts have upheld that that's okay, a reasonable cost. But one thing that is very important is the police can't look at the content or look at your group and say, well, you all are controversial, so we're expecting more counter-protesters,
Right.
and thereby charge you more.
Right. We've seen that.
Yeah, and they can't. The courts have said that's not allowable, because you're basically singling out that message. So if you've got a controversial message, or you are someone that's controversial and you want to go out and publicly demonstrate, it's up to the police to respond accordingly to protect everyone involved. That's why we all, we're joking, we all pay our taxes, we all pay for that public security that is not to be placed on the person that happens to have a controversial message.
Right.
And again, if you feel like you've applied at some jurisdiction or some county or park, and they've come back with an exorbitant amount of money or some astronomical fee, please contact us, because we certainly would appreciate.
Yeah, sometimes
looking into that.
a well-placed phone call,
Exactly.
can clear things up.
Yeah.
So one more question we have here, which is, the right to film, does that, and I think we touched on this a little bit, does that apply to private property as well?
It applies, well, yes and no. Classic lawyer, it depends, but most of the time when you're on someone's private property, if they have an expectation of privacy, then you could possibly be invading their privacy if you're filming,
Right.
and just out and about or on their private property. Generally, though, if it's private property but they're welcoming people in, then they need to make it clear to you that there's no filming. A lot of times you may go into a business and start filming, and they say, well, for proprietary reasons, like we want to protect our trade secrets or
Sure.
something. They may ask you to quit filming, and that's within their rights because they're private property. But generally, when you're out in public, and generally, Virginia is what's considered a one-party consent, meaning there's if I'm filming myself out,
Right.
I don't have to tell you that I'm also filming you. I'm
Right,
the
one
one that's
party
getting, yeah.
knows.
Yeah, but the other, but you have to be very cautious when you're talking about private property, because if someone has an expectation of privacy, then you're basically eavesdropping at that point, or you're violating their right to privacy. So, just again, common sense, filming in private areas and bathrooms, in private spaces, going into someone's house and surreptitiously filming them is not appropriate.
Right.
But out in the public, sure, that's your right. You can go out in public, snap pictures, film everything.
Okay.
So.
All right, well, great. Well, we want to thank everyone for joining us. This is something we're starting to do a little bit more of, so if you have ideas for future topics that we can talk about here, let us know. Again, ACLU-VA at ACLUVA.org. This video will be retained on the Facebook page, as well as posted to our YouTube channel and also on our website. More information about knowing your rights available at ACLUVA.org.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.